Good afternoon, and thank you to the Vanport Mosaic for allowing us to be a part of this virtual festival. We're honored to be a part of this conversation and a part of the memory activist community. My name is Allan Lazo. I'm the Executive Director of the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. We're a statewide, private, nonprofit civil rights organization whose mission is to end housing discrimination and ensure equal access to housing throughout the state of Oregon. As an organization working toward housing justice, when we consider the question about who gets to be an American, our attention naturally turns to what we might consider one of the seminal factors in what being American means, namely, attaining the American dream. We often picture that American dream as a home with the green lawn on a quiet suburban street. My parents were immigrants from the Philippines, and that certainly was the dream that they embraced and the one they worked so hard to provide for my brother and sister and I. Unfortunately, that same American dream is fraught with a history of racial segregation and exclusion that, in the light of today's COVID-19 pandemic, reminds us that these systems intended to oppress and deny opportunity to certain members of our community, that structural racism put in motion many of the factors that have led to the disproportionate outcomes for our Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. As we all have watched the news these days, we see the statistics and stories about those disparities playing out today in many forms. Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color are being disproportionately impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. The Centers for Disease Control statistics show that Black and African Americans make up 21.2% of fatalities, despite being only 12.3% of the total population. In Oregon, at least 22% of the cases have been among those who identify as Hispanic, despite making up just 13% of the population. But to truly understand the nature of this disparity, we must dig deeper, beyond the headlines and oft misstated narratives. As I was preparing for our time together, the internet, of course, delivered to me this beautiful and inspiring graphic by Elise Ruriani, an artist and social justice advocate in Chicago. The graphic illustrates a number of underlying systemic factors that can create an environment leading to mental health issues. And many of these same factors are the ones that we need to dig deeper down into to see in this current health pandemic. In the housing justice movement, we recognize, as seen in this graphic, that the history of racial discrimination and racial segregation in housing plays a significant role in that base upon which health disparities are manifested. This afternoon, we'll look at how those systems of exclusion created the conditions that have today put those Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color at greater risk, and consequently resulting in the statistics we're seeing today. Our history of racial discrimination and racial segregation in housing that has in part created those conditions, such as crowded, unsafe, unstable housing, disinvestment in communities that are closer to sources of air pollution, and areas of greater concentrated poverty that have led to today's disparities. We must center these underlying factors as a means to counter preconceived narratives about race and communities of color that then are translated into narratives about disease. These narratives then become self-fulfilling prophecies or beliefs about communities of color upon which further unjust policies are based in response to those beliefs. So it becomes vital for us to examine this history of not only systemic policies and practices, but also the language of race, exclusion, and disease that have been woven together to create these narratives. Right here in Portland, the fear of a potential bubonic plague outbreak in 1907 was blamed on Asian community members. In the mid-19th century, South and East Asia dealt with a series of plague outbreaks. At that point, the bacteria that caused the plague had not yet been identified, nor had the fact that it was carried by fleas living on rats being proliferated by merchant ships. A narrative quickly grew that there was something about these Asian populations that made them susceptible to the plague. Some even claimed that it was because they ate too much rice and not enough meat, racializing a race-neutral disease. This was the narrative among white Americans when rats carrying the plague reached San Francisco in 1900. Immediately after the first confirmed casualty of the plague, a Chinese-born lumberyard owner, the entirety of San Francisco's Chinatown at that time was quarantined. The policy, based on the false narrative about Chinese residents, was devastating for Chinatown, and it ultimately was declared unconstitutional in federal court. This minor outbreak ended in 1904, and during that time, researchers discovered the true vector of the disease was rats, which became crucial information when the disease resurfaced again in 1907 in San Francisco, and the federal government urged West Coast cities to take immediate preventative action. In Portland, Esther Pohl Lovejoy led a massive rat extermination campaign, as well as leaning on waterfront business owners, such as these areas in Portland, to improve sanitation and eliminate the use of dilapidated structures where rats were likely to live. This more informed and deracialized approach was a resounding success, with Portland becoming the only West Coast port that did not have a single incident of plague that year. Still, that did not stop some in the community from using the threat of the disease to again advocate for segregation and quarantine of certain races. State bacteriologist Ralph Mason told the Oregon Journal, quote, "If we cannot compel the Hindu, Chinaman, and others to live up to our ideals of cleanliness, and if they persist in congregating in hovels and hoarding together like animals, the strictest kind of exclusion would not be too severe a remedy. In any discussion about place, we first must acknowledge that all the lands we live on are lands taken from indigenous peoples, which also is true throughout Oregon, like every other place across this country. Where I'm presenting from today in Portland was the land of many Chinookan tribes that accessed the rivers bordering the Portland area. As we've all seen, and as we've noted here, people of color are clearly at greater risk than others during this pandemic. Among the most vulnerable are Native Americans. For example, in the Navajo Nation, a people with homelands in Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, early on in this pandemic, the mortality rate among the Navajo reservation's 170,000 people was at 30 per 100,000. At the time, only 6 states had a higher per capita death toll. The impact of COVID-19 on the Native American community is reminiscent of previous disease outbreaks that ravaged Native American communities for centuries, resulting in catastrophic loss of life, far greater than even the worst-case scenarios for COVID-19. Over the course of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, the rate of indigenous population decline was upwards of 90% based on best estimates. The narrative about these impacts had long been that the lack of immunity to novel viruses brought to the Americas decimated these populations. But again, we need to dig deeper, even on these types of narratives, as again, it has been the systemic genocide of the indigenous communities shown in this slide as the lands being taken that are at the root of those health impacts. Until recently, histories of disease and Native Americans emphasized this virgin soil epidemics theory. However, new research provides a much more complicated picture of disease in American Indian history. From an April 19th article in The Atlantic titled, quote, "Disease has never been just disease for Native Americans," it said, quote, "The virgin soil epidemic hypothesis was valuable in countering earlier theories that attributed Native American population decline to racial inferiority, but its singular emphasis on biological difference implied that population collapses were nothing more than historical accidents. By stressing the importance of social conditions created by human decisions and actions, the new scholarship provides a far more disturbing picture. It also helps us understand the problems Native communities today as they battle the novel coronavirus. These same conditions would also make Native communities susceptible to a host of other diseases. Native vulnerability had and has nothing to do with racial inferiority, or, since those initial incidents, lack of immunity. Rather, it has everything to do with concrete policies pursued by the United States government, its states, and its citizens. Although the virgin soil epidemic hypothesis may have been well-intentioned, its focus on the brief, if horrific moment of initial contact consigns disease safely to the distant past and provides colonizers with an alibi. Indigenous communities are fighting more than a virus. They are contending with the ongoing legacy of centuries of violence and dispossession. In addition to this history of systemic displacement and oppression of Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color, we also know conditions that have created disparate outcomes also make those communities the continuing targets of hate and harassment. As the COVID-19 pandemic spread around the world to the US, bias incidents against members of the Asian American community began to increase significantly. In the 6 weeks preceding May 13th, the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council received more than 1,700 self-reported incidents from across the country. And another poll published on April 28th found that 32% of Americans had witnessed someone blaming Asians for the pandemic, a number which increased to 60% when asking Asians. The bias of language almost certainly has played a role. Many in the government and media for months insisted on referring to the virus as the Chinese virus or Wuhan flu, in direct defiance of a 2015 directive from the World Health Organization that diseases should not be named after people, places, or animals, which could be negatively impacted by the association. This WHO directive may have been a direct response to a 2012 coronavirus strain known as MERS, or Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. Mosquito-borne West Nile virus, first detected in the United States in 1999, also exoticized the disease and played into a foreign invasion trope. In Oregon's history, again, as in many other parts of the country, and particularly along the West Coast, communities of color also have experienced a long history of exclusion and harassment. When Oregon was coming into the Union as a state in 1859, our Constitution excluded Blacks from coming to Oregon, and that past exclusionary ideal gets reflected in today's Black population in Oregon, which represents approximately 2% of the state's population versus about 13% in the US population. That same Constitution also excluded those who were of Chinese descent from owning land or mining claims. Chinese and later Japanese communities, which had been drawn to Oregon as laborers, were secluded to segregated Chinatowns or Japantowns. And during the mid to late 19th century, Chinese laborers coming to work on the railroad or in mines in Oregon were subjected to violent attacks, which also were occurring up and down the West Coast. This vitriol, again, fueled by racialized, health-related language. Similar to the anti-Chinese sentiment in this 1886 Puck magazine cover, there's this quote from the Grant County News in 1885. Quote, "To everyone, it is apparent that the Chinese are a curse and a blight to this country, not only financially, but socially and morally. As we strive to dig deeper into the underlying roots of these acts of hate and harassment, and these narratives that express the racist ideals of the time, we must recognize that the systemic and institutional racism that drove inequitable policies of yesterday continue to beget injustice today, including in our current pandemic." As I started out noting, in the work we do around housing justice, we know that historical patterns of racial segregation are deeply tied to today's outcomes. It is also a little interesting to think about financial recovery beyond this pandemic. Will there be large government financial programs to help bolster the economy? Will those programs be equitable and just? Because that certainly was not the case when we look back in history at one of those programs intended to bring the country out of the Great Depression in the 1930s. Prior to the creation of the Federal Home Administration in 1934, buying a home meant making a down payment of 50% or more for a home and then paying off a mortgage in 5 or so years. With the insurance of the FHA, you could then buy a home with, say, 10 or 20% down and pay the rest off with a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. The way we think of buying a home today. Really the opening up of that American dream for so many that I referenced at the beginning of this presentation. However, FHA loan underwriting standards incorporated racial segregation principles and racial biases. Those underwriting standards were based in part on a list from a federal appraisal manual that valued neighborhoods based on their racial makeup. This list, widely used from the 1920s throughout the 1940s by real estate appraisers, ranked lighter-skinned whites at the top, with blacks and Mexicans at the bottom, and did not even include Native Americans. The use of these appraisals led also to the development of color-coded maps that determined the loan underwriting risk in a neighborhood. The practice we know of as redlining. This redlining of neighborhoods that predominantly were communities of color led to extreme racial inequities in FHA loans. Between 1934 and 1962, of $120 billion in loans made by the FHA, less than 2% went to non-whites. So these post-Depression and later post-World War II institutional policies, such as the GI Bill, which also had similar racialized inequitable outcomes, created wealth-generating benefits for several generations, but left out communities of color, particularly Black and Latinx communities. The resulting disparities today are borne out through the racial wealth gap, where white families have 8 to 10 times the median accumulated wealth of Black and Latinx families, based predominantly in the denial of access to generational wealth building through homeownership. The other continuing legacy of redlining also has been in health disparities. We know that where you live can determine your health outcomes, including how long you might live. Last year, a research team at NYU analyzed the discrepancy within cities between census tracts with the longest life expectancy and those with the shortest. In this chart, not a single one of America's largest 50 cities had a life expectancy gap between those neighborhoods of less than 10 years. Some of the most racially segregated cities, including Chicago, Washington, D.C., and New York, have a gap of nearly 30 years. Even Portland, number 35 on the list, has a life expectancy gap between the longest and shortest life expectancy census tracts of nearly 20 years, shown here from the chart and then again on a map of Portland. Based on factors we've discussed, it should not be surprising that the census tracts at the opposite ends of this spectrum are sharply divided along racial lines. According to a CityLab analysis of the data, all of the cities with the highest life expectancy gaps had neighborhood racial ethnic segregation scores more than 5 times that of the cities with the smallest gaps, noting the impact of the long legacy of racism and exclusionary placemaking policies. This becomes an opportunity for us again to dig deeper into these health disparity narratives. That narrative in part blames individual behaviors or cultural forces, some narratives that we have seen even playing out in today's COVID-19 crisis. But a study conducted at Northwestern University found a very different dynamic. Following more than 2,000 African Americans from highly segregated neighborhoods over 25 years, this study found that those who moved to a less segregated neighborhood had a significantly lower blood pressure than those who stayed, illustrating the impact systemic conditions have on individual health outcomes. Finally, let's turn to the impact on public policy that this history of exclusion and further the racialization of language might have on public policy. The Immigration Act of 1891 barred all people suffering from a, quote, loathsome or contagious disease in 1898. This was given as the reason for 2% of rejections of immigrants. By 1915, this had risen to 69%, despite an overall decline in infectious disease rates over the same period. In Silent Travelers, Germs, Genes, and the Immigrant Menace, A.M. Kraut points out that this may have been because the screening list used by the U.S. Public Health Service was steadily expanded to include chronic, mental, or moral conditions, in the absence of actual diseases to worry about. The language of racial eugenics had made its way into the public health and immigration and was crystallized in law with the National Origins Act of 1924. And while the restrictive and racially motivated quotas of that law were finally removed with the Immigration Act of 1965, restrictions based on perceived threats to public health continued. Previous health crises, like the HIV/AIDS health crisis in the late 20th century, also impacted public policy, such as immigration policy. At that time, those policies targeted Haitians and sub-Saharan Africans, and reports of hate incidents against Haitians and Africans living in the United States exploded. Another among many instances of racially motivated action by the government that can be used to legitimize or normalize bias incidents at the interpersonal level. We also know that in Oregon, Latinx and Hispanic communities have seen the highest rate of impact from COVID-19. According to an Oregon Live article in late April, Latinos accounted for 31% of Oregonians with coronavirus whose ethnicity was known, even though the community represents only 13% of the state's total population. This, while advocates also have noted and warned that Latinx populations may be fearful of reporting symptoms or being tested over concerns about legal reprisals. Latinx and Hispanic communities have also been part of the racialized history of disease. During the final plague outbreak in Los Angeles in 1924, as soon as the first few cases were identified as being among Mexican residents, the Mexican district of LA was quarantined by the city health department. And in one instance, management at the Biltmore Hotel fired its entire labor force of 150 people when they arrived at work. Associating Mexicans with this disease did not end with the quarantine. And a 1928 report by the California Development Association titled Survey of the Mexican Labor Problem in California described Mexicans as, quote, sizzling with disease. Today, though even among the rising hate and discrimination, the COVID-19 crisis may be beginning to shine the light on these racial inequities and the need to create equitable solutions. In Franklin County, Ohio, the state's most populous county, which encompasses the capital, Columbus, commissioners this week passed a resolution asserting racism, quote, rises to the definition of a public health crisis. A CNN story noted the Franklin County Board of Commissioners, citing the Health Policy Institute of Ohio, wrote that, quote, racism and segregation in Ohio and Franklin County have also exacerbated a health divide, resulting in Black residents having lower life expectancies than white residents, being far more likely than other races to die prematurely before the age of 75, and to die of heart disease or stroke. The coronavirus pandemic, the Board of Commissioners said, has exacerbated the health divide between white and Black residents. Quote, a contemporary example of such disparity is highlighted by the coronavirus data in Franklin County that Black residents are hospitalized at twice the rate of other demographic groups, and preliminary data in Ohio that suggests African Americans are dying at a disproportionately higher rate from the disease, the resolution states. So, as we close out our presentation, is there hope for a just future that will rise from this intersection of race and today's pandemic? Will the light from today, once again illuminating this long history of injustice rooted in systemic and institutional racism, shine bright enough to allow us to dig deep enough to truly uncover and undo those root causes? Please join us now for a live discussion about these and any other questions or comments that you might have. Thank you all so much. Great. Again, thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. In watching that, I recognize that there's so much heavy material there. So everybody, just a quick deep breath and gratitude to the Vanport Mosaic Festival for having us here today. And I'm so excited to be joined by Donovan Smith from Gentrification is Weird. Hey, Donovan, how are you doing?
I'm good. How about yourself?
I'm doing great, thank you. As I said earlier, just like everybody else, I think probably about as well as can be expected these days.
Right. Yeah.
How about yourself?
It's a lot of energy out here right now, but yeah, doing well overall.
Fantastic, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to check in with you first, if that feels okay, to see how all of that landed with you in what's going on today, and not just in the world in general, but also what we see happening here in Portland in our local community.
Yeah, I think the way that you are outlining the fact that where we're at with these disparities ultimately is a reflection of like bad policy making over decades, and that's, you can look national and you can look right here at home and see why we get the effects of places like Woodburn and Cornelius and East County having the highest flare-ups in the state of Oregon. And like you said, I didn't know how badly the Latino community had been hit in terms of numbers, but it's not surprising just based on our history. And so, yeah, I think, as we're trying to find solutions, we had to be careful, even here in Oregon, to not get caught up in the language around individual behavior as being, like you had said in your presentation, as being the reason for these flare-ups. I think none of us have ever dealt with a pandemic unless you happen to be around for the Spanish flu, which if you are, if you were, congratulations, congratulations. But individual behaviors are the slimmest piece when we're talking about what this virus is doing in terms of wreaking havoc on our communities. And so it's going to take a lot of deep digging to make good policy, and really, really look at the different communities specifically in terms of their needs as well. I forget what city you just named as passing a race-based resolution that recognized how race disproportionately is affecting folks right now in the COVID outbreak. But Portland did too. Our city council just adopted a resolution. I think it was May 20th, and did something really similar. And it was really just a framework. You know what I mean? It was a framework to say that we're going to center equity in our response. All the bureaus in the city of Portland have an equity lens. I think we have like 20 something bureaus within the city of Portland. And they've already had equity lenses. So the resolution is not all that surprising, but it's gonna take more than just having that on paper. It's gonna take like really digging in with community organizations and individuals to see what it is that we need in these responses. Because I've already been hearing from people, even with Prosper Portland, putting out things like these relief funds that some people have been missed or haven't known how to apply for these things. And, those trains come and go. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, thanks for that reminder about what Portland did. I agree. It's a little bit different. Where the piece I mentioned that I saw that came out this week was from Franklin County, Ohio, which is where the capital of Ohio, Columbus, is, and the most populous county. And I think one thing that we note is, as you've pointed out, for communities of color, we've known for a long time that racism is a public health crisis, right? We don't necessarily need policymakers to confirm that for us. But I think what it does is what's similar to what Portland did is, without policymakers, and especially white dominant policymakers, recognizing that, we don't bring up that structural piece, those institutional pieces, to that policymaking level. Just like you started out saying, what happens is we tend to focus on individual symptoms rather than the actual disease. And I think that's why that graphic to me was so powerful when I came across it this week on Facebook, saying, yeah, we could look at individual mental health issues, but really those underlying pieces in the systems are what we need to address if we want to address these pieces that our communities are experiencing. And so I think that's what's powerful in Portland's piece. So yeah, let's look at those systems and what's coming out in our policies and the benefits we're offering, to see, are they equitable? And so we'll see, as I always say about some of our policies here in Portland, I think it remains to be seen how that actually turns out, right?
Right. Yeah, and I think that's pretty much nationally too. Like, what is it actually going to turn out in terms of policy? One thing that I'm really tracking closely is, TriMet got $184 million in that federal care money that was released, and so even our president tweeted about it, like literally. TriMet specifically added them and everything. It's great. But regardless, how is that money going to be enacted in an equitable way? Especially, there's a lot of talk of like frontline workers, a lot of them being Black and brown, and a lot of them are, if you actually look on these buses, a lot of Black folks are driving these buses as well. My mom being one of them. But one of the things that's been interesting to me is, TriMet as a quasi-governmental agency, they haven't enacted, this hazard pay. And so just even thinking about things like that, like why, why was that not at the front of everything? Because you're not, when you're thinking about policy making and all these things, right? Like you're thinking about the effects that you're having on folks. Like it's not even just about who's contracted the virus and who has not. It's about that compounding interest of like stress and bills that you can and can't pay. And these are the things that we need to be thinking of when we're talking about putting extra pay in like essential workers' pockets. It's just like when we're thinking about other things, like I don't want to get too far off topic here, but we talk about things like police violence, and we'll raise the names of people who have been killed. And that is important, but we also have to think about the people who just got harassed on their way to, crossing the street. And that is a part of the police violence too. So anyways, we just have to really talk to people, and sometimes we don't even need to have that long of a conversation. We just need to do common sense things.
Anyways.
I
think I'd go back to what you're saying about who are considering essential workers these days, and,
right.
and not getting things like hazard pay. Again, it goes back to the framework I was saying about, we can't just put in place what we think are equitable policies, right? We really need policies and outcomes that are just, because policies that are equitable across the board don't serve those needs that are varying by communities that have been created by these disparities we just talked about, that by the systemic and institutional pieces. So if we institute policies that are just equitable across the board, then we are missing out on what actually is justice for a community that has been denied opportunity in the past. And so I think that's one of the things we should be looking for potentially in policies around equity today is, are we accounting for those past disparities? Because even in the work we do, around the Fair Housing Act, one of the things we recognize is the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968 may have stopped discrimination at that point, but it didn't make up for the history of discrimination and segregation that continues to cause disparities today. And so we really need justice-focused policies and outcomes today, the way I see it.
Absolutely. And, you were naming certain things around exclusion laws for like Chinese folks and African Americans here in Oregon as well. Like those ripple effects continue into today. And so we have to think about the communities. Yes, we need to look at BIPOC communities and like non-white communities, and recognize that there's just an absolute disparity just because you're not white in the state. But then there's specific things. It's if you're making policies across the board for folks, you're really not getting at the root. It's like if somebody, I'm trying to use the right language here. It's you can't give cancer treatment for heart disease, essentially. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And
right.
recognizing that they're both diseases and they both have nuances to them. So again, just like I was naming off with, with the Prosper relief money, it's important that that money is like really, really targeted to Black communities, really, really targeted. And like what was done, in the Jade district, that was a good example of being ultra targeted.
Yeah.
So we need to continue to do that and elevate that those type of targets moving forward.
Yeah. One of the ways I frame it is about being very intentional about what we not only what we intend to do, but what we intend our outcomes to be. Right. And so both of those sides, being very intentional about what we intend to do and whether or not we're reaching those. Let me return to a piece where you and I intersect some in the work that we do around fair housing, and Kirsten Hayes, who's watching today, made the statement about placemaking policies. I think that's a big piece of this, right? Talking about, for us specifically in the housing justice movement, about policies that were long ago put in place around placemaking, around making neighborhoods, and what we do today to kind of undo those. And I know that's work that is of interest to you around gentrification and the involuntary economic displacement of the Black community. Do you feel like we're seeing successes in any places? Anything that you would bring forward? Success is a hard word, isn't it?
It's success, yeah. That's why I had to take the pause. I think there are frameworks that we should be paying attention to in terms of like the preference policy as a framework where you're getting points for, as the city is developing certain housing in the Northeast core, and saying we recognize the damage that we've done as an entity, and with the entities underneath us through policies like redlining. And therefore, as we're developing, we want to be able to get some people to be able to come back into these houses that have a little bit of a cut in terms of how much you have to pay.
Right.
And assigning points for people based on their generational ties to give them preference to get into those homes. That is an interesting framework, and is something that can be improved upon. And there's other parts to the preference policy as well for like people who are homeowners and whatnot. Those are things that are interesting. I think what happened with the Williams and Russell project, for example, in terms of legacy, wiping out all these people's homes in the 70s, and now the city coming back to community and saying, how can we rectify this? What can we develop here that, it's taken a few years, 2-3 years now. People are still doing some visioning on that 1.7 acres. And it's taking that time because, it's there's so much to sift through. But I think it's one example of like a framework that we can be thinking of that, and there's a few others, right? But all of those things need to be scaled. Like anything that's happening, it's like they're ultimately still crumbs in terms of what has been siphoned out. And it's not just in terms of economics, it's in terms of like, it's in terms of culture, what's culturally been taken out. And I think there's been some acknowledgement by different people in the city that you can't replace that part fully at all. But it's something that we need to keep at the front of our minds.
Yeah. Let me return to that culture piece in a second too. But I agree with you, because the other piece of not just the pieces in North and Northeast, but is also looking at the area to where that Black community has been displaced out in East Portland now. Right now, you've got communities that are settling there, and some that are saying we want investment here as well. Right. So it's not to me. One of the things I talk about, it's not an either or. It's really an and. Can we do both in North and Northeast and investments in East Portland? So that's one way.
Yeah, and I think it's even like, you know, it's we're in a census year again, right? So like so much of I know you've seen the map a million times in terms of 2000 to 2010, the last census year, and 10,000 plus Black people being flung out from North and Northeast. And do the census if you haven't taken it. It's so vital in terms of like what money goes to what communities. But you know, it's not like an absolute thing in terms of that either. Like I think there is a huge need for you know, looking at what Black community needs out in East County, and Gresham and Fairview and all these different cities. I think that is one of the challenges that comes with like us being displaced. So many of us being displaced out that way is that you're actually dealing with a lot of different governments and everything, because once you get past 162nd in some pockets, then you're actually in Gresham, and then you're living in Portland proper if you're on 161st. And so there is collaboration by these governments, but it's difficult to navigate. And so organizations like Beyond Black are important to engage with in terms of that work. But it's my point was that we've been scattered throughout the city. We're in downtown Portland, we're in Aloha, we're in Beaverton, we're in Vancouver, and we're in all these places voluntarily and not voluntarily. So like looking at good policy in terms of like rectifying what's happening with Black folks is really going to have to take looking at that as a holistic thing, not just as a, oh, Black people are out here now and let's make that policy. It's going to take looking at us a lot more holistically. With that being said, there is a lot of will around place in East County. I'll just point to what Beyond Black did. And last year they did the first ever Juneteenth in Gresham, which, if you're not familiar, Juneteenth is a celebration for when people who were enslaved finally knew they were free, because that wasn't something that got to them immediately after the Emancipation Proclamation. So it's a national holiday. First time it happened out in Gresham, had like 2,000 people out there at Vanport. And so I know when I was out there, Gentrification is Weird and Friends of Noise, we were curating the stage for that event. And one thing that I heard consistently is that people were like, I wish there were more things like this happening out this way. So,
yeah, that's what I wanted to go back to, because I know that's another part that that you're heavily involved in, is the arts and culture piece of it, right? How does that play into what it means to keep a community whole, and how we should envision that as part of community development efforts, right? It isn't just about the streets and the houses. There really is a heartbeat and a soul of a community. It gets lost in all of these kinds of histories, right? How do we contend with that?
Yeah, I think arts are so central to everything. And I think actually during this virus, we should be realizing a lot more how art is central, because how many of us are listening to music to pass the time? How many of us are reading books, you know, to get through this? You know, I see all your CD collections back there, so I know you've been, you know, spending time with art. But art is very undervalued in terms of our day-to-days. And I think, you know, just in terms of one of the efforts, in addition to like the Hill Block, Williams and Russell project, is like the Interstate Firehouse Cultural Center. I sit on the committee for bringing that back online, right? And so it's been, that was a committee that was supposed to be formed and have 4 meetings to decide how to bring it back online. The city owns this property now. That was 2 years ago almost. And the reason that it has gone this long is because we recognize that Black arts are essential to our community, and as we're looking to make the investments in this building, we're not just going to do something frivolous. We're going to take the time, and what's come out of it is we're still in the recommendation phase, but it's a complete reimagination of what this building and institution actually is. And so that is something to think about, is like, I think with policy, sometimes we can rush to respond, for whatever reasons, sometimes for virtue, sometimes for, just getting something that can meet an immediate need, whatever it may be. But I think when you actually, have time and care, you can make those effective, again, policies. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens with the IFCC building in the coming few years. But that's just one example that I think of in terms of like arts and vitality and community.
Right on. Right on. Yeah, and I think there are so many places around this city right now where sort of placemaking is happening.
We are getting some comments, I'm seeing.
Yeah, right on.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah, and so I was going to comment about what Chisao was saying about the Oldtown area or Chinatown, Oldtown area, and there are so many places in our city where these histories are being erased. Right? We think of what happened in Northeast Portland with the involuntary displacement of the Black community. We know that Oldtown Chinatown also has a displacement of, initially the Japanese community that was there for Nihon Machi. And then now the Chinatown has been significantly displaced out to East Portland along 82nd at the Jade District. Right. And so really somewhere along the line, we've got to sort of ask ourselves as a community, how do we preserve some of these places? You talk about, what was the Hill Block building and the Williams and Russell project in an effort to bring some of that back. But, I don't think there is not just one answer to how we do that. The issue that Chisao was talking about in Oldtown Chinatown is about kind of redevelopment of height restrictions that are happening in that area that could really impact the character of what once was, again, these ethnic enclaves. And so I think those opportunities exist in lots of places around our city. We're going to see the Broadway corridor redeveloped, which was the original center of the Black community. And so, to me, there are a lot of different pieces that go into how we impact those projects. Part of it to some degree is representation, right? We need to get folks into decision-making positions that can help drive those projects and drive what's there. We see that at Williams Russell, right? It sounds like in Oldtown Chinatown that may not be happening, and lots of places around the city it's not happening. So for me, one of it is just representation and access to power. Any other thoughts that you have about how we might help drive those processes more community-focused and equitably?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is engaging with more people. I think a lot of the same organizations and conglomerates get tapped a lot of times, which that's good for, having some consistency, but also like, because we're such a smaller community in regards to like the general population of Oregon and Portland, thinking about widening who you engage with is important. But also, like, one thing that I've experienced with city versus like metro regional government policies and everything is that the city doesn't pay folks traditionally to engage on these committees. And so like, that's one thing that I'd like to see change a lot, because you're only dealing with people who are extremely tapped and then having to like dredge up so much of your emotions to even sit on these committees and make recommendations that you're not even sure are going to be listened to. I think it's important to make sure that people are compensated And that's whether you've been on 100 committees or it's your first one. So I've seen that a lot from, again, Metro. I haven't seen that from the city. I think that's one thing. And I think, again, these timelines are important, but really thinking about, is it this committee that's been formed, is it just hitting some check marks, or is it actually moving the needle? Is it bringing in newer voices? You know, is it challenging us to do something different? So
Yeah, right on. Yeah, I hear you about that too. I agree with you 100% that, one, around the fatigue, right? We get on these committees and we're doing this work and we sort of never know whether or not there's any control over outcomes at all. Yeah, and then I think the same thing. Reaching different communities is really important, or different members of the community, because our communities aren't homogenous. Right? There's just one way to do things or one opinion that's represented there. And so, I think those are all totally right on point for how we need to proceed. And that compensation piece, it is interesting to see how different entities have approached that. Some better than others, and so it'd be nice for everyone to recognize, everyone meaning anybody who is needing or wanting to go out to communities to access them for that engagement, to really recognize what an effort it is, or it can be, for members of our communities to engage like that, and especially given the histories, right? I think also part of that recognition is we're not starting from today. We're starting from a much longer history that impacts how we approach those engagements, right?
Right. And when you think about what they do for other things like procurement, or you think about the type of contractors that the city will hire out, like they're paying, extreme amounts for their expertise. So that same kind of like thought process should be given towards communities that you traditionally disenfranchise. Is like, how can we, recognize us as experts, and know that we actually are. And I will say one good example of engagement and like changing a city process that I'm aware of is the 7th and 9th Greenway Trail, that the city had been working for or planning for years to put this Greenway bikeway trail through 9th Avenue. It was going to cut through 9th Avenue. It was supposed to connect from like downtown and past Northeast Portland. And then when the rubber was starting to meet the road in terms of like that project, there was some people working within the Bureau, as well as people who were just kind of generally aware of the project, who were like, this can't come through this part of town, not like this.
Right on, yeah.
And as they deepened the engagement with the community, there was a strong kind of conglomerate with bikers who wanted it to go down that 7th Avenue way. But a lot of the people who had been living in the neighborhood, Black folks, did not want it coming through there. And there were so many institutions that were like key to the neighborhood. PCRI buildings, King School, and some others. And so people kind of advocated and deepened and slowed down that process. And what ultimately ended up happening, because of the will within the Black community, because of the listening that happened, and having some Black employees as well within the city bureau, is that project got moved over to a couple blocks to 9th. And it may have been a little bit more of an inconvenience for people who were more avid bikers, but it was something that culturally meant a lot.
Yeah.
So I think that that is one good example of what can happen when you more deeply engage with different constituents.
Right on. Yeah, yeah, and I think it's an example, like you said, of not just checking the boxes, right? Not of just, okay, we're going to hold this public meeting and here's what's happening. You all have been informed now. It's of really, having this goal of listening and understanding what an impact might be on a community. The other thing we saw, on the Williams Avenue bike lane projects was also, making sure that when you are going through that process on those projects is recognizing the history that's already there, right, in a community, before you get too far down the line, are proposing solutions that are completely tone deaf to what the earlier impacts may have been, because those tensions can still exist there. And then getting through a process that does actually listen to the community for sure. So, yeah, I think it's all great. Yeah.
One thing that I wanted to note, just in terms of this conversation, would be remiss if I didn't name Geneva's as as one of the fallen soldiers of COVID, and Geneva's barbershop has been so key in North and Northeast. And I was talking to my mom about it. I was like, I feel like outside of like churches, I don't know if there's like anything that's as much of a staple that's like long-term Black pillar as Geneva's. And because of the slowdown that's been caused by this virus and everything, the Knowles family made the decision that it will ultimately be better to shut things down. And that's also there's so much within that story. I'm sure there's no shortage of Mr. Knowles and his family being tapped in. I'm sure they knew where to look in terms of resources that were coming from the government and locally, and could have been supported by community at large. But I think ultimately, like, the protection of community was at the core of their decision, and the protection of making sure that building could, still be profitable for another Black business, which they ended up bringing in Joe's Caramel Corn, and I believe Hannah's PDX is going to be the next tenants there. But this would have never happened if it wasn't for COVID. Maybe they would have closed down some later down the line. But yeah, just an unfortunate hit that's come with this virus.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think lots of folks in the community kind of felt that also. And I think it was interesting to watch that development a little bit on Facebook, and to hear Mr. Knowles, very intentionally, again, talking about what he intended to do with the property and making sure that whatever happened to it next didn't add to the displacement of the community. So I think that was really, not only did he not want to harm the community by keeping that institution open, but also not harm the community by letting it get into hands that would not benefit the community. So I think everybody's excited to see Joe Brown's Caramel Corn come in. I love getting me some Joe Brown's Caramel Corn at Lloyd Center. That smell is something else.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think we're just about a minute or so from wrapping up, Donovan. So if there's anything final you want to say, the Vanport Mosaic Festival folks, again, thank you so much for having us. And just want to remind folks that this memory activism continues through the 31st, and there's some big events coming up this week. So please join the Vanport Mosaic Festival throughout the week for more events. Donovan, any last words from you about what we've heard or talked about today?
No, just thank you for having me on. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you to Vanport Mosaic. Myself and Bruce Poinsett, we actually have an event coming up tomorrow as part of the festival. So it's called 106 in Quarantine. We'll be screening Northwest hip hop videos. We've been doing this pretty much since the virus broke out, but this is going to be a throwback show. So we'll be showing videos from the 90s and 2000s. And we have facilitated conversation around these videos, and we'll actually have two of the artists in the studio. We'll have Cool Nuts, who has just been the pillar to Portland hip hop scene for years. We'll have him, as well as Mizzolini, who's also been one of the fixtures in the scene, to kind of share their history and their stories of North and Northeast and just kind of what they're seeing today. So encourage everybody to tap into that event. It'll be live on Zoom. You can register at the link in my bio on Gentrification is Weird on Instagram. And then we'll screen the interviews later as part of the festival as well. So 5:30 tomorrow, live on Zoom, 106 in Quarantine.
All right. Thank you so much, Donovan. It's been a pleasure speaking with you this afternoon. Always great to see you.
Yeah, likewise. And stay safe. Be well.
Yeah. Thanks all.